Gene and Dave Show.
This program was made possible from the support of VSA Texas and Amerigroup.
Rise up, Amerigroup.
We're here today at AT&T with Dr. Aaron Bangor. Aaron, you are, would it be safe to say, the head of CATO?
Not the head of all of CATO. I'm the overall technical lead for the organization, but John Bruns, who's the assistant vice president, and is the head of all of the CATO organization. He's based in Dallas.
Okay. What is CATO and how has it evolved over the years?
Sure. So CATO is our shorthand internally with the company for the AT&T Corporate Accessibility Technology Office. And we were started about 5 years ago, last month, 5 years ago, really to do a better job of addressing accessibility of technology across the entire AT&T company. So we have grown as a company from being a local phone company and providing local phone service. We're now a large provider of broadband internet services, obviously wireless phone services and data and messaging and so forth, and a very large TV service provider. Not only with our UVerse service, but with the acquisition of DirecTV a couple years ago. So that's a wide variety of consumer technologies. And we're also a very large business services provider. So it became more and more unwieldy on how do you very efficiently, but also make sure that you get the right outcomes with accessibility, sort of doing it ad hoc, letting everybody kind of do it their own way. And so in 2012, we did a couple things that really helped to change the culture within AT&T around accessibility. One was we appointed our first ever Chief Accessibility Officer to really be the head and the high-level advocate within the company around accessibility.
Would this be worldwide operations?
The Chief Accessibility Officer covers all of AT&T. So all products and services, consumer, business, wireline, wireless, so forth. And the second thing we did was created our Corporate Accessibility Technology Office, or CATO for short. And we staffed that primarily with two types of folks that really drew on skills that AT&T has and what our business units within the company, the various divisions and silos needed. One was folks with a strong process and compliance background. When you have a company of over 250,000 people, how do you establish a program that works for not only the size of that company, but also the diversity of products and services? And we had a lot of good resources within the company to draw on. And then the technical expertise. How, when a project team says, I've got an app to develop, how do I make that accessible to a screen reader user? I'm building an IVR, which is an interactive voice response system. When you call customer care and it's press 1 for this or 2 for that, how do you make sure those systems are usable by somebody with limited mobility or cognitive or hearing disabilities? Websites and hardware, emails, PDFs, text messages, the list of different types of technologies that we had to work on was quite great. And so there's not really a place where you can go to find somebody that has that diversity of skills, who knows how product development works, and how do you work with a project team. The accessibility skills for more than just websites, but for anything that might be needed. and really to understand the technology we're in. So knowing how TV services work, whether it's in a traditional cable box, set-top box arrangement, or on your mobile device, how telephone services work, internet services work. So finding somebody with a combination of those skills is challenging, if not impossible. So we found people that had some of those skills, and we got them together here in Austin, as well as some folks from other parts of the company in other parts of the United States, so St. Louis and Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, and so forth, and said, all right, if you know how to develop products and services, you're going to teach the accessibility experts how that works and how you integrate accessibility into a large corporate product lifecycle management. If you know about wireless technologies and how the macro cellular network works, you're gonna teach the accessibility folks and the product development folks that, and while they teach you the accessibility and product development. So it was a great collaboration. A lot of people that were willing to learn and grow, and all toward a common purpose, which is to really teach product development teams across the company, literally thousands. That first year, we probably looked at somewhere around 10,000 projects, to give you an idea of the scale. And had to get an idea right off the top. Does this have accessibility implications? You know, if we're running a new fiber optic cable to a cell tower in remote West Texas, we're not really worried about the accessibility of that. But you know, if it's an update to AT&T.com or the My AT&T app or customer service lines, you know, that obviously is going to get a huge priority.
Well, can you give us some examples specifically of things you do to help the consumer, someone with a disability?
Certainly. I think we try to be, not on purpose, but we actually try to be fairly boring about how this gets done, because it's the benefits. What we're looking for is that the products and services AT&T offers will be accessible to our customers with disabilities. And so, you know, that is working through thousands of projects that are updating AT&T.com. It's not a whole overhaul of the entire website, but anytime a page changes, how do we make sure that that when they're updating text on that field, that it meets readability guidelines for plain language, so that it's easy to understand by somebody with limited cognitive or language skills. How do we make sure that there's a skip navigation on there for somebody using a screen reader? If there are videos on there describing how to use one of our products and services, to make sure that it's captioned. And if there's voiceover to narration to that video, that it doesn't just say, push the button here, and there might have been an arrow in the video, but for somebody who's blind can't see that, to describe what is the button that's there. So actually a lot of the work are pretty straightforward things, like following up with the project team, saying, do you know what you need to do for this? You're updating a mobile app. Do you understand if it's for Android, you know, what Google's accessibility standards are for developing Android apps, or the Apple accessibility standards for iOS apps and so forth?
I gotta confess to you, I'm not the brightest bulb in the knife drawer. So, although I have a strong interest in technology, I don't use the cell phone myself. I just haven't figured out how to do it, given I can't use my fingers. But I try to keep up with what's happening, and I know there's so many people out there that use AT&T products every single day, and they just don't realize all that work and effort you put in to make it accessible to everybody. I think I even read somewhere that the AT&T logo was redone so the contrast was greater.
Yeah, we've had a very successful partnership with our brand team. When we first approached them about the color choices they were using, even beyond the globe, but just the colors on the website, you know, the blue and the orange and accent colors like green and so forth. we had been given the impression by people who worked with brand before, it was like, well, they're a bunch of artists who really have a vision and it's really hard to talk to them. But we found the opposite to be true. We said, what we're looking for is making sure that we're providing the right color palette and guidance to how to use those colors to the product team, so that if you're developing a website or a mobile app or something, that they're being used in a way that produces enough contrast for people particularly with low vision, to be able to use. And they said, that's great. One of the biggest frustrations we have is people don't follow the guidance we give them. They have a vision for how they want the color to be used to improve engagement and emotional connectedness and all these kinds of qualitative things. But people go like, well, we'll just use colors however we want to use it, and they just kind of do a slab of this and a dab of that. And so what we found is a great partnership is they own the brand standards of what the colors were and how they should be used, but they had no real enforcement mechanism to say you really have to use this. They just said we want you to use this. But we had sort of the opposite, which is we didn't have the platform in terms of owning those standards, but we had the need to say you need to use these in the correct way. And so we worked with them to tweak a couple colors.
How would that be different? Well, it's from the ADA. I mean, does the ADA mandate have anything to do with the web? I mean, the web was, let's say, invented after the ADA was first written, first passed.
So I'm not an attorney, and I won't play one on TV.
Okay.
But from a technical standpoint, there are no standards for web accessibility under the ADA. The ADA really is focused on ensuring equal access to goods and services. And so really what it's saying is, in providing goods and services, you can't discriminate and you need to effectively communicate with your customers. Now, this is still, different courts have ruled different ways about whether or not the website needs a connection to a physical place, or it could be just standalone because it's goods and services offered to the public, and the viewers can go and research that. But to answer your question is there really is no direct answer to your question. From what we've chosen to do in the absence of any standards around website accessibility, it's very clear what most people, if not all people, are using, and that's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines from the W3C, specifically level AA, which is sort of a next tier up in terms of quality from the basic single A.
If you people are developing web pages and understand accessibility, you know exactly what Aaron is talking about. If not, there are a number of web standards out there that people should follow to make it as accessible as possible for people. Now, I understand AT&T was pretty much proactive in developing CATO and in developing this process to make all the products and services accessible. And in fact, let's see, I wrote it down here somewhere, the Global Initiative for Inclusive Information and Communication Technologies praised AT&T for CATO, calling it an industry model. An industry model is a pretty strong term. I mean, are there any other businesses doing what AT&T does?
I think there's been some big companies out there that have had a long-standing commitment to accessibility, and what I've told people is that any accessibility initiative is going to have to be tailored to that company. So I don't know that any company does it quite like us, because we're there's unique circumstances within AT&T, but I think IBM and Microsoft as companies that have had significant commitments in the past and continue around accessibility. I think the important thing to get across is that it's not this isn't something where you have to be a big company to know how to do these things. The information is out there, and so whether you are a company of 4 people or 400,000 or some size in between, to learn how the technology you're building in the first place, how you make that accessible is available. And pretty much most of it's free. Certainly websites and mobile apps are very common in this day and age for new technologies. And the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, they're the ones that standardize what HTML is, so what the web really, how it operates. They also say this is how you make websites accessible, so it's part and parcel. The makers of the mobile platforms, Apple and Google with Android, they have guidance on how you make their apps on their platforms accessible, and it's all available. A lot of it comes down to being skillful with how you develop an app, a website, or technology generally, and doing so in a quality way, and not sort of taking shortcuts. Because a lot of times those shortcuts may not be apparent until you connect assistive technology to it, or you start interacting with that technology in a way that the developer does not, but that people with disabilities do. So using, navigating a web page through your ears instead of your eyes.
Well, let's say I'm a businessman. I've got a small business, but I've got ambitions. I think I'll become a medium, maybe even a large business someday. And AT&T provides services for me. Now, being a smart guy that I am, I want to reach as many consumers as possible. So I want to make sure my product and services are accessible to people with disabilities. Would I look up, or how would I go about making sure my products and services are accessible? Since AT&T is my choice to provide services, would I contact CATO at all, or would I look to outside services?
So if you are a medium or large business, generally you're going to interact with AT&T through an account executive, somebody that manages you as a customer, and so they're going to be your point of contact for any questions you might have, whether it's just a plain old billing issue all the way up through, is this an accessibility? And you'll probably work with a sales team if you're thinking about becoming an AT&T customer. And I would encourage prospective businesses or existing businesses to ask about, how is this accessible? And the better questions you ask, the better answers you should get. Certainly if you are in the government asking about, is this Section 508 compliant, would be a perfectly great question to ask.
If you're Section 508 refers to Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which requires all the government contractors to provide accessible internet services. Is that right?
Well, it requires the government itself. So Section 508 applies to the federal government, and most state governments, including Texas, have laws that say that they have to buy accessible technology. Now there's some caveats and nuances of that, and we could talk about in more depth. But basically, that's saying when you contract out for a company to build a website or provide your telephone service to your offices, that those need to be accessible. And Section 508 has specific standards. It says what accessible means in the context of telecommunications equipment versus websites versus standalone hardware and those sorts of things. And those standards are ready to be updated here. It's been approved and will go into effect next year. So that's one of the things that CATO does is since we have most, not all, the accessibility expertise in the company that's dedicated to accessibility, we look at that and we update the guidance we provide to the project teams that are developing our products and services and saying, here's what these changes mean for you, and specifically what you need to do as a project team as you're developing technology, and ensure to make sure that you're, certainly first and foremost complying with law, but more than that, to make sure that products and services are accessible to, as well as usable by, our customers with disabilities.
How does anyone keep up with that? I mean, the technology changes so quickly. I mean, particularly in the area of apps. There's a new app coming out. I don't know how often, but I know it's got to be frequently. Maybe every day, maybe every couple hours.
Well, as I said, I mean, we in a given year, we're probably looking at 8,000 to 10,000 projects going that we review. Not all those. A large fraction of those don't require accessibility or any changes to make them accessible. But it's a large scale, and that's been our biggest challenge. Really, is the scale. How do you do this? Because we couldn't hire enough accessibility experts to assign one to every project that needs it. So we've structured it more around how do we make sure that project teams know where to get help and have help when they need it in a way that makes sense to them. And so it's about providing them good training resources, clear standards on if you are doing particular technology X, that you know exactly what you need to do to make that accessible, and that there are people, really human beings who understand how to make things accessible, available to talk to when things get a little confusing. But that's another one of our roles, is to make sure that we are paying attention to where the technology is going and where not only the technology in the industry is going as a whole, but how AT&T is using that technology, or AT&T technology AT&T is developing. So we need to be very aware of what's going on across the company and figure out how we can best make sure that there's not a gap between the technology and the accessibility solutions.
So in addition to following where other companies go, you're actually also leading the way in some accessibility.
Oh, definitely. I think the best example of that actually is sort of like breaking news. On Friday of last week, so December 1st, we launched a service called Real-Time Text.
Oh, I read about that, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, so Real-Time Text is a solution for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, have speech disabilities, or deaf-blind, to use the telephone network to make and receive calls. For the last 50 years, the only way they can do that is through using TTY devices. And these are keyboards that you can connect to a phone, and the TTYs make tones on the regular telephone line, so nothing special has to be adapted or changed or installed. And if there's another TTY at the other end, it hears those tones come through the voice line, just as you would hear another human voice, and they decode that back to text. And it's in the 60s, it was actually, I think, an extraordinary engineering solution to how do you make the telephone network accessible to individuals who are deaf and have hearing disabilities or speech disabilities or both. But where the technology is going, it's just not keeping up. It's antiquated analog technology, but you could have your latest iPhone 10, Samsung Galaxy S, whatever, or any other smartphone. And prior to Friday, the way somebody who's deaf would need, if they needed to call 911, for instance, or even if they just wanted to call their mom, they would have to connect, a TTY to their smartphone and have a conversation with another TTY that, or through relay services. So real-time text takes the same principle, which is the ability to communicate visually, through text, but modernizes that. So it's using internet protocol, it's using the same underlying network framework that we use for providing HD voice calls. So it is not really a separate solution. It's a solution built in.
Well, let's say someone who's deaf or hard of hearing wants to contact me. They would use this real-time text app. Is it? And well, how is that? How would that be different, say, than just? Well, I suppose, than just texting me.
Yeah. So I think first, let's assume that you do have a smartphone in this case and want to contact you. So today, what that deaf person would have to do is they'd have to connect their TTY to their smartphone, and unless you had a TTY yourself, which is a $200 or $300 machine that's big and bulky and looks like an old typewriter, so probably not.
No.
So, so they're going to call 711 for relay services, and they would have a TTY conversation with the relay operator, and that relay operator would call you, and they'd be sort of the interpreter. Now, there are other types of relay services out there. There's video relay service that allow that deaf person to communicate in sign language with the relay operator. IP relay that allows sort of an internet chat with that relay operator. But in all cases, they are communicating with a relay operator who's making a traditional phone call to you and interpreting and being the intermediary for that conversation. Today, with real-time text, if you both install the real-time text app AT&T launched last week on your phones, a deaf person could call your phone number, your regular cell phone number, and they would, when they set up the call, saying whether or not they want voice or text or both. So maybe they just say, I'm going to make voice in and a text call. The call would come into your phone, and it would say that that deaf person's caller ID information from your address book, just like a regular cell phone call. But it would also say, do you want to answer with voice by itself or by voice and text? And of course, this person, they're offering text on the call, so because they're not going to be able to use their voice. And you'd answer, and in addition to having an audio channel, a traditional voice call there, you would have the ability to have a real-time text conversation. And that's a little different than like text messaging. So text messaging, you compose the entire message, you hit send, and it goes off to them, and they might get it in 5 seconds or 5 minutes, you don't know.
Oh, yeah.
But with real-time text, it took the best parts of TTY, which is as you type, the other person on the other end sees what you're typing. And the best example that I've used to sort of illustrate why that might be important is think about if you're calling 911 for an emergency. And you can do it in many parts of the country, not all yet, unfortunately, but you can send a text message to 911. But let's say you started typing, I'm having chest P, and you stop because you were overcome by a heart attack at that point. If you never hit send, nobody ever knows that you needed help because that message never went through, you never hit send. With real-time text, you type, I'm having chest P, that part of the message comes through. 911 operator is going to know what that means. And the fact that you've stopped typing also is very helpful for them to diagnose the severity of your situation, right?
Okay, yeah.
So this is when we say real-time text, we mean real-time. As you type, that letter, that character will appear. Real-time text is better than TTY. With TTY, it was like a walkie-talkie conversation. Only one person in the conversation could type at the same time. So you had to develop, instead of saying, over, like in a walkie-talkie, you would say GA, type GA meaning go ahead. Real-time text can use basically all the characters on your phone's keyboard. So uppercase, lowercase, those are sort of boring, but you can use symbols from the shift keys. Emojis we're working on. That's an extended character set. But pretty much anything you'd have a normal conversation, maybe not with a millennial, but a conversation with The with TTYs, everything was in capital letters because they didn't have
Oh, so
enough character set to do upper and lowercase. You got uppercase characters, you got the numbers, and you got maybe about a half a dozen characters. So, like for instance, you couldn't type an email address because there was no @ sign.
Oh, wow. Hadn't
So-
thought of that.
So it was an older character set based on teletype machines from 100 years ago. So as I said, in the 60s, that was a whole lot better than what the deaf community had up until then.
I can
But
see someone today seeing all capital letters and say, "Quit yelling at me."
exactly. And so real-time text, both people can type at the same time. You get sort of these character set. It is, really, it's a modern day way of doing functionally what TTYs used to do, which is allow a real-time conversation, back and forth, turn-taking, like a voice call. But TTY had some of these technical limitations, and we think with real-time text, those are largely, we've taken the good things from real-time text, and we've taken the good things from modern internet protocol type technologies and blended them. And we've been, the disability community, the deaf community in particular, has been very supportive of our efforts, because it's been about 4 years since we originally said we need to make this happen before it actually happened. And that's because there's a lot of moving parts to that, including we had to literally get the law changed to allow us to launch real-time text.
Oh, really? Wow. We're getting a lot of changes at an act of Congress.
Well,
That's-
unfortunately, in this case, it wasn't an act of Congress needed. We just needed the FCC to update the rules. And when we explained what we wanted to do and why we wanted to do it, and what real-time text was, and what we thought the benefit was, and that the deaf community in particular was on our side, it took a while, but we working with a lot of partners and a lot of support from the FCC staff, were able to get that done last year. So,
Well, speaking of working with other folks, I first met you years ago at Tech Club, and then I saw you recently at the Lex Friedman Awards banquet. And in your speech, you mentioned the importance of involving people with disabilities. I know you've always been active in the community. For the real-time text, I'm just curious, was that something AT&T said, we got to make this happen, or were customers calling and saying, we need a better way, or how did that come to?
it was really a combination. So part of it was, we didn't invent real-time text technology. It existed before 2013 when we first identified it being something we needed to move the company toward. So there had been a lot of work prior to that on identifying that. Some in academia, so for instance Greg Vanderheiden at the Trace Research Center then at the University of Wisconsin, Christian Vogler at Gallaudet University was instrumental in helping us understand real-time text and what it can do and the benefits to the disability community for that. From a standards perspective, so I mentioned HD voice, so as we've built out a new voice network to support things like HD voice and video call and these other types of things, it's based on international standards for how mobile services operate. Well, embedded in those standards already, somebody had already done the legwork saying, hey, TTY is not supported on this network, but there is a service called Global Text Telephony, is what they call it, GTT. That is, and they pointed to standards that existed within the telecommunications industry that define that. And then even in government circles, in 2010 a law was passed called the Communications and Video Accessibility Act. And one of the things it required the FCC to do is have an advisory commission, and one of the reports they generated was how do you transition from TTY to next generation services. And so we had a lot to build on, standing on the shoulders of giants, as Newton said, to kind of learn But we also made sure that we were engaging with the disability community to understand that this wasn't just in theory, this wasn't just a, kind of an academic exercise or something that was not really wanted. So I mentioned Christopher Vogler at Gallaudet as being somebody to work with. AT&T for over 10 years now has had an advisory panel on access and aging. And so we have, for instance, a member on there from the deaf community, Claude Stout from TDI, and we had brought this up to the panel generally and specifically to Claude to get feedback on it. So every time we mentioned that, we wanted to move past TTY to a modern technology to support the communication needs in this fashion. We got a positive response. So we knew we were moving forward. We did some public demonstrations of what real-time text could be to other service providers, to managers of 911 call centers, to regulatory agencies, the FCC, Department of Justice, and to the disability community. And they were, again, very positive about what this could do. And changing how our network works while still making sure everybody's calls go through a text message and whatnot. It's been a lot of planning and development. This wasn't an off-the-shelf solution we could go to a vendor and say, hey, can we buy a CD with real-time text on it and install it in the network? We support over 100 million customers on our voice network. So
did you hear that, folks? AT&T does tons of accessibility stuff out there. You don't hear about it every day, but it's all going on behind the scenes. Which reminds me, Aaron, not a whole lot of people know this, but you've got 15 patents to your name.
I'm up to 30 now.
30?
30.
See, now, our executive committee wanted me to ask you, why stop at 15? But you're up to 30. Well, that's old information I read. My God, 30 patents.
AT&T is very supportive of that. Not all of those patents are in accessibility, but most of them revolve around my time either in the accessibility team, or before that I worked in AT&T Labs in what we call our Human Factors Engineering Group. And so a lot of the work I did there was, how do you design ways for customers to interact with our products and services, which is a lot of inventing things. And so part of that was also putting on an accessibility hat. How do you make technology easy to use for all of our customers? Certainly almost 20% of those customers are customers with disabilities, and that plays a factor in it. So
20% of the billions of people in the world is a lot of people.
It is, and obviously disability is a diverse, to sort of lump everybody and say it's uniform is a misnomer. The one thing I think that helps when looking at accessibility, and really it comes from the same training looking at how to make products and services usable, is rather than focusing on what the technology can do, to also, not in lieu of, but to also consider that a person that has to use that, and if they can't accomplish something productive with that technology, it doesn't matter how cool and whiz-bang and all the features that technology has, a product or service we offer, if a person can't make it use out of it, it's also not good. So it's not that the user experience trumps the technology or the technology trumps the user experience. It's they've got to work together to get to a productive result. And making sure the folks that sort of live and breathe the technology understand that at the end of the day, that a person, not them, has to use it. And it's not even it's not them different. It's they don't spend 40, 50 hours a week thinking about how that technology works, and have probably gone to school and learned a lot of things and keep up to date through reading and so forth on that technology. You have somebody who spends 40 or 50 hours working on something else, and the product or service they buy from AT&T is something they want to be able to pick up and use and not think about a lot to accomplish what they want, but not invest, hours and hours of time. And once you sort of begin to understand the mindset that you can either be the average customer or you can be the person AT&T pays money to develop this, but you can't be both at the same time. If you can get people to wrap their minds around that, and when asked which one they want to be the one that AT&T pays a lot of money to,
Sure.
to develop that technology, then you sort of begin to have this humility that says, okay, maybe I don't have all the answers on how customers will use this, customers with and without disabilities, and you begin to become open to this idea that how is somebody going to use this? Somebody not like me, and then the next step is to talk about, customers with disabilities use this technology in a way you may not have ever seen or heard about, and getting that message across. And so in addition to sort of preaching technical standards and training, one of the things we want to get across is this idea that that customers with disabilities can use all of our products and services when they're made accessible, but only if you as a project team is developing a new product or service or updating the existing one are aware of what they need and actually do that work. And we've generally found that I can't think of any product developer we've ever talked to that purposely wanted to leave people with disabilities out from what they build, but they don't know about anything about accessibility.
Right.
And to do a couple things. One is to educate them and find some time in their otherwise busy schedule to get them to think about a new way of working with technology, not to replace their old ways that they knew, but to add to that, and to make sure they understand the importance of it, not just from you've got to do this, that that the accessibility office is coming and telling you you've got to do it, but that that it's good for business. The 20% of customers we talked about. I like to. The other statistic I like to cite is that about 30% of U.S. households have a member with a disability. Somebody that
30%. That's a lot of households.
That's about one in three, right?
Yeah, that's huge.
So can you imagine, if you're living in a house with somebody with a disability, you're not going to buy the inaccessible product and say, well, tough, or I'll do it for you. You're going to say, we're going to buy the accessible one, so that you can participate in watching TV or using the internet or phone service just like everybody else in the household. There's, obviously, it is the right thing to do. It's, as a company, we want to make sure that we're serving the needs of all our customers and not saying we're picking some and not others. And then lastly, accessibility really requires you to think more deeply about how you're building the technology that underlies the products and services, and then putting together the products and services as well as websites and mobile apps and things that kind of go along with the services we offer. Because you're thinking more deeply, it really spurs you to think more creatively about the problem and solve for it. And so that innovation, is that's a lifeblood of a company that's in the technology industry in 2018 and has been and will continue to be.
This man would know about innovation with 30 patents.
Yeah.
So, Aaron, we've been speaking with Aaron Bangor, the lead principal technical architect. Is that the right title?
Yeah, that's one of my
your
titles. So I'm lead accessible technology architect as well as director of accessibility solutions engineering.
Super. When you folks go to the Genie Dave Show webpage, look for this show on CATO, CATO. Look for our summary page, and in there you'll see a link for real-time text and some other information you may want to know about the great work AT&T has been doing. Aaron, thank you for having us. We appreciate it very much. Take care.
Appreciate you coming by. It's been great talking with you.
Super. So long, folks.